please. Yep. You. So hello everyone, good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining us here today for the launch of Democracy Next new paper on 6 ways to democratize city planning. My name is Claudia Schwallies. I'm the founder and the CEO of Democracy Next. For those of you who joined us a little late, we've just asked everyone to put in the chat where you're joining us from and why you're interested in being here. We'd love to get a sense of where you're all from and what interests you. So the plan for today's meeting is my colleague James and I were going to start with about a half-hour or so presentation that gives you a bit of a sense of who we are at Democracy Next, why we decided to do this work and why we believe there's a need to democratize city planning. We're going to cover some of the high-level propositions that are in the paper that we published yesterday and go over the open call for applications that we've put out with that. We're honoured and delighted to also have two of our international task force members who are going to share some reflections with us today. So Trivik Verma and Diego Luna Quintanilla is also going to speak. My colleague James will kind of introduce them properly with their full biographies before they speak later on. And we have a good half hour, 35 minutes or so for conversation before we will wrap up. So before I dive into things, though, I'm just going to pass over to James to introduce himself as well.
Good morning, and well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. So my name is James. I'm a project leader for urban design and planning here at Democracy Next. I come at this work as a former landscape architect, having worked in Canada and Germany for many years. I approach this work really from the perspective that people, at least in the experience of my work in the field, have not really been genuinely engaged in many of the decisions that are made about the cities that they live in. And really just trying to change that at Democracy Next.
Thanks, James. So Democracy Next, who are we? We're an international nonprofit and nonpartisan research and action institute. We believe in a more just, joyful, and collaborative future where everyone has meaningful power to shape their societies. We're working to shift who has power and how we're taking decisions in government, as well as other institutions of daily life, like workplaces, schools, and museums. We're an international knowledge hub on deliberative democracy, so we create tools and resources like our assembly guide to build the field and also experiment with new innovative governance approaches. We also advise on the design and establishment of new democratic institutions, processes, and spaces, including citizens' assemblies. At the end of the day, what we want is more people to see the democratic potential of sortition, meaning selecting decision makers by lottery, deliberation, and participation for strengthening trust, reducing polarization, and improving decision making. We believe that these principles are what enable us to really be with complexity, to channel our collective wisdom, and also to find common ground with one another. These are the faces behind our lovely images and graphics at Democracy Next. This is our team. We've all been really involved in this project, as well as our fellow, Gustav Kjærved Nielsen, who is also joining us here for this morning's event. And he helped in some of the research and our international task force convenings too.
So to do this work that we'll talk to you about today, we knew that we really needed to tap into a much larger collective intelligence. So this is why we asked an international and diverse group of people to help us shape the proposals we'll present. This involved working together online in virtual meetings, sussing out some of the most pressing challenges facing cities and their decision-making processes, while also hearing about some incredibly inspiring examples of citizen engagement from cities all over the world. So we came together in person at the Humanity Hub in The Hague, where DemNext is headquartered, to sketch out an initial outline of the paper and proposals. After this convening, we also shared drafts of the paper with a group of almost 100 people from around the world to ask for their feedback and input, which was an extremely insightful exercise and really helped shape the final outcome of this project.
So why did we do this work on democratizing city planning, and why do we think that this is an important issue that deserves reflection? Well, many of the biggest issues that cities are facing today are down to city planning related issues in some way or other, whether that's to do with housing, with high rents or home prices, affordability or lack thereof, shortages, homelessness, NIMBY or YIMBYism, but also the climate mitigation efforts, links to public health and well-beings, and the inequalities that surround these issues are front and center in many, many different cities and countries all over the world. And of course, while each city has a different context, what we found from some of the early conversations that we've been having with people, as well as a scan into some of the research on this, is that these these issues are really widely shared, and the frustration amongst the diverse actors in the ecosystem is also widely shared. So from the planners to the architects, elected officials, public servants, and of course also just everyday people and citizens living in cities, there's a sense that the system isn't really working the way that it should be for everyone. So what we feel is that we don't just need different policy solutions to these issues, we need a different way to take planning decisions. New governance models can help break through deadlocks and give legitimacy to hard decisions that require the trade-offs involved in these types of planning-related decisions. What we also have is a great deal of inspiration and evidence, though, from another way of doing things. So while a lot of traditional engagement that happens on planning issues tends to be through, calls for public consultations and comments on already developed and fully existing plans or town hall meetings, we have actually seen that also citizens' assemblies have been taking place around the world, and that issues to do with urban planning, environment, strategic planning, as well as health and infrastructure, which are often interlinked with planning issues, are really up there in terms of the number of examples that we can be learning from. And that this is just one part of a much bigger trend that has been going on around the world for more democratic and legitimate forms of public decision-making that have also given us an evidence base of how do we need to be doing assemblies for these to really be effective and democratic tools. And cities have been at the forefront of this innovation, leading the way with most examples taking place at this level of government.
So since citizens' assemblies have taken place mostly at this local level, and for questions about urban and strategic planning, environment, and health, we thought that it would be good to give you a couple of concrete examples which are referred to in the paper in a bit more detail. So the first is Bogota's itinerant citizen assembly, which was an effort that one of our task force members, actually, Felipe Rey, has played a part in shaping. So in 2020, the Bogota City Council, through its public innovation lab, Demo Lab, launched a sequenced representative public deliberation through the itinerant citizens assembly, which is directly attached to the city council. So this is an example of a permanent, ongoing citizens assembly that has had numerous chapters or assemblies over the last 4 years. This has involved hundreds of citizens from all 20 districts of Bogota who have been tasked with forming recommendations on things such as land use regulations and the 20-year vision for the city. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen, an ad hoc citizens assembly was initiated in 2023 to facilitate citizen deliberation over a significant climate infrastructure and urban development project that was greenlit without initial public engagement. So the project involves the creation of a new island, actually, intended to protect the city from storm surges while actually creating a huge new landmass for urban development. After receiving a lot of backlash and stirring up plenty of controversy in the city, it was decided that a citizens' assembly would be initiated to shape the future of the project. So the question that citizens were asked was, how can Lunetahome, which is the name of the island, become a district that supports sustainable development for people, nature, and the environment in the capital area in the future? So this is an example of how a city is really trying to reconcile the controversial decisions that were made without that early public engagement. So an initially weak democratic conversation with citizens was eventually transformed into a strong one by empowering them to scrutinize the project and come up with recommendations in response to the question above. So the citizens' recommendations have now been published publicly and handed over unedited to the citizens' representation in the municipality of Copenhagen. And now we're waiting a response from the municipality itself.
So James kind of covered two examples out of the over 200 or so that have taken place on planning related issues, and I think bring to light in a less abstract way why these principles, though, of sortition, deliberation, and participation are what really help to unlock the potential for new and different ways of doing things and engaging people around planning issues. So sortition is one of these really key things that's very different from most existing engagement processes. So most of the time in the way that traditional engagement happens, people self-select to participate. And while there's something in terms of good intentions and something really nice and noble about the fact that things are open and technically anybody is able to participate in something, we also have a lot of research which shows us that the people who do tend to participate when they're just volunteering their time tend to be a lot wealthier, have more time on their hands, or tend to be more white and more in the most urban parts of a place. So they're not very representative of a wider population. And sortition is what helps to get around this. So randomly selecting people to be part of an assembly. So the way that this happens in practice is there's usually two stages to this process. So in the first instance, there's a very large number of invitations that get sent out to a large number of people. So around 2,000 to maybe 30,000 people will receive an invitation that's addressed by the mayor or the city council, or perhaps the chief city planner in this instance, inviting people to volunteer themselves as potential assembly members. And that invitation letter will spell out what is the issue that's going to be addressed, how is this process going to work. It answers some of the frequently asked questions and the things that can help break down those barriers to participating. So the fact that people will be paid, that childcare will be provided, that like, no, you don't need to wear a suit, all these sorts of things that like encourage more people to say yes to that invitation. And in the second stage, there's a second lottery process that takes place because amongst everyone who says yes, there's still some disproportionality in terms of the demographics of who's volunteering, but because of the randomness of the invitations going out, there's also many people who don't typically go to town hall meetings or participate, who may not even be voting or be part of politics or civic life more broadly, who have said yes. And so in the second lottery stage, there's a technical process called stratification to ensure that that final group is broadly representative of the community when it comes to things like age, gender, geography in the city, and something that captures socioeconomic differences and perhaps some other criteria. At the end of the day, it's a political decision to decide by which criteria do we want this group to be representative of the community. And then the second key principle is deliberation. So deliberation just means weighing collectively evidence to come together to a shared decision off the back of it. And what these citizens' assembly processes enable is the time and the resources to be able to do that, to build trust with one another, to be with the complexity of an issue, and to strengthen people's agency involved. And so leading up to an assembly, there's usually a wider community engagement phase where people with lived experience of an issue are also engaged to make sure that that becomes part of the evidence base of an assembly. People have time to first get to know one another, to identify their shared values before diving into a quite in-depth learning phase. So the breakdown here, just to give you a sense, is kind of if an assembly were taking place over 5 days, but most of the time, actually, these assemblies are taking place over much longer periods of time. So learning is a key component, hearing from different stakeholders to be able to get to grips with different perspectives on the issue being addressed. There's a phase of deliberation and then consensus building. So trying to move from just hearing what is the information, also bringing in everyone's perspectives to work towards identifying what are our shared recommendations of what we want to do to address this issue. And crucially, and this is also quite different to many other engagement processes, typically the threshold is 75 to 80% consensus is needed for these to become a recommendation of the group. And those recommendations then are delivered to the public authority that has commissioned and initiated this assembly process. So it gives a sense of how these citizens' assemblies are quite different in terms of a lot of the characteristics to how engagement typically happens as well. For all these reasons, citizens' assemblies are at the heart of the 6 proposals that we've drafted together with our International Task Force on Democratizing City Plannings. But these examples that we've been talking about also highlight why our focus has been on systemic change, because one-off approaches have definitely been needed to test what works and show what's possible, but they've also highlighted that it's not enough to fundamentally change things. So our 6 proposals here are focused on, in a way, trying to change the rules of the game. So there are three different types of assemblies that are at the heart of these proposals, and we'll explain them as we go through the different examples that we'll share. So there are ad hoc, meaning one-off assemblies, community assemblies, referring to the hyper-local ones, and citywide assemblies. But our proposals are not just about assemblies either, and I really want to emphasize this point. We really thought about how these democratic institutions need to be in relationship with public authorities, city councillors, urban planners, developers and investors, as well as civil society organizations. And beyond that, how they need to be connected to people living in cities more broadly. So how these can be linked up to other engagement initiatives like community mapping, citizen science initiatives that may be happening, data gathering, and other participatory approaches. So we've been thinking about this as a way of really expanding the ecosystem and improving the relationships between these different actors involved. So what are these 6 ways that we're talking about? We'll walk you through here the kind of high-level aspects of these propositions, and there's a lot more details in the paper, and we're happy to also elaborate or answer any questions about them when it comes to the discussion point. And James will go through the first 4 of these.
Right. So the first scenario we outline is if you are a city or a region about to initiate a major infrastructure project. So something like a new subway line, climate infrastructure, or something similar. Since this is likely to have a long-lasting and significant impact on communities and the city at large, we suggest implementing an ad hoc citizens assembly to shape these initial project objectives and perhaps some of the key design goals to align them closely with the community's wants and needs. This also has the potential to reduce significant public pushback or criticism and avoid the high cost of prolonged public hearings or protests. Taking the example from Copenhagen that we mentioned at the beginning, initiating an assembly at the beginning of that process might have helped to avoid some of the pushback that resulted in protests. It's also possible to think of the assembly not only as a one-off engagement process, but as a recurring set of assemblies related to that infrastructure project. In a long-term project of 10, 20 or more years, there should be more than one deliberation than one at the very start. The second scenario we imagined is one where if you are a developer in the early stages of a large urban development project, it would be extremely beneficial to initiate this process with a citizens' assembly. In some cases, the developer is not always the bad guy, and sometimes they're just as frustrated with the current status quo for engagement. So why not initiate one to generate higher quality, community-supported design strategies and site programming that in turn enable the creation of places where people can connect, thrive, and live. This could also help reduce risks for the developer themselves and create better conditions for investment while securing greater public buy-in from the very beginning. The third scenario we see an ad hoc citizens assembly being helpful is in the creation of a city's long-term strategic or financial plans, or in the creation of a significant piece of urban policy. So typically people are just not part of shaping that wider vision of the city or the place where they live in. But in doing so, you can create the conditions for a diverse set of perspectives, life experiences, and visions for the future to come together. This could also have a trickle-down effect on policies that come directly out of that plan or vision, which could also then be informed by another assembly or wider participation strategies. The fourth example is where we think an ad hoc citizens assembly might be useful is while we're working kind of within the bounds of reality at the moment, perhaps there are actually ways of changing the existing legislation around what kind of engagement is legally mandated and when. So from our conversations with numerous people working in government or in urban development, it's clear that there's this frustration with the status quo of the kind of town hall style public consultation. Often these forums don't include the diversity of perspectives that exist in a city and are generally quite poorly designed. They don't really create the conditions with the time and space to really carefully consider options, trade-offs, and the complexities of a project. We're not saying that wider public engagement isn't necessary, but we argue that considered, informed, and constructive forms of public engagement need to be part of that wider ecosystem and could potentially be legislated as a baseline standard for engagement.
Indeed, thanks, James. And just to emphasize really that what we're saying here too with all these examples is that we're not suggesting that these assemblies should be happening necessarily on top of all those existing things, but that a lot of the existing mechanisms are not really helpful or the most constructive ways of doing things. So this can be a really good replacement to those to those approaches. When it comes to the fifth one, it's a different kind of assembly model. So talking about the member or community board assemblies. So many cities of all different sizes have this more hyper-local level of resident engagement with what are sometimes called either community boards or neighborhood associations or councils or community councils. And these are typically either self-selected, sometimes elected bodies, but they're often not very representative of the neighborhoods that they serve, and typically don't have a huge amount of influence or real power on decision-making either. And of course, those two issues kind of reinforce one another. If the group is not very representative, then it lacks the legitimacy to speak on behalf of the community and doesn't fully reflect its diversity. So what we've thought about have been some reforms to how these types of community assemblies or councils can work, with some suggestions about how to transition to new ways of working. We do also want to recognize, though, that there is a lot of goodwill amongst the people who do volunteer and get involved in these kinds of self-selecting initiatives at the moment. So we've thought about how to keep some of that spirit, but how to really partially replace the membership of these councils so that at least more than half of their members can be chosen by sortition to be more representative of a community's diversity. We've also reflected on how the mandate of these councils could evolve and how they could be connected to the other types of assemblies that we've outlined. And to keep that mix of seasoned and fresh perspectives, we've suggested half of the members being replaced with new members each year. And that might be the sort of thing that turns these assemblies into fully sortition-based assemblies over time. And it could be the consideration for if these don't exist in a community and want to be established, there might be a potential to kind of skip that ineffective self-selecting way of doing things and establishing sortition-based community citizens assemblies instead. And finally, we have also reflected about what could be going on at the citywide level. So this could be an ongoing assembly with members who are rotating over time and each assembly taking place around new issues. So we have talked about this being primarily focused on planning, given the wider focus of this work, but I did want to emphasize that this framing could also be a bit different. So there is a permanent citizens assembly in Paris, for example, that has a general mandate, though thus far most of its work has really focused on planning issues, given that this is the core of what a lot of city government focuses on. So right now, the City Assembly is working on two citizen bills, one to do with homelessness and the other one to do with greening the city. And there's also a permanent citizens assembly for climate in the region of Brussels, where again, many of the issues are concretely intersecting with city planning issues. So if the desire is to keep it general or framed differently, if it's about planning or climate, from our perspective, like what really matters here is the establishment of something that is a more anchored assembly that connects in to the city council, to the administration and other relevant institutions, so that there's a connection to feedback and input from that wider community informing its work as well. And another important aspect being agenda setting power. So perhaps there's a need for this assembly to decide on a specific issue that could go to a one-off or ad hoc assembly for the city council to initiate, or it could have agenda setting within the assembly itself. So for example, in Paris, this is the Paris Citizens Assembly, the city council at the start of this assembly cycle in September of this past year presented the assembly with 3 of its most pressing issues to choose as the focus of one of its bills. And so the assembly deliberated amongst itself and voted to work on homelessness for the next 9 months. And for the other one, the assembly members brainstormed ideas amongst themselves and then voted to work on greening the city. So this is what we mean by agenda setting. And because these assemblies are able to meet more regularly and over a longer period of time, they have more time to get into the complexity of some of these longer term urban challenges, like homelessness, for instance, that a shorter ad hoc assembly wouldn't necessarily have the time to be able to tackle. So we've shared these 6 different scenarios and starting points, but just before kind of closing up on this part of our presentation, just wanted to zoom back out to this image and emphasize how really taken together, each of these different proposals would be transformative for how a city planning decision-making system in a city works. So not all of them may necessarily be relevant in every single city, but most of them will. And depending on a city's context, there's always at least one place to be able to get started. But we want to make sure that these ideas do not just live in a pretty paper, and we want to bring them to life and inspire others to be able to do so too. So we have an open call for applications to cities to work with us to implement this kind of more systemic, transformative change to how city planning works. Concretely, what does this mean in terms of how that would work? So on our end, what we would do is guide each city through a learning program. So going into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty around some of the stuff I gave the high-level introduction on around how sortition works, how the deliberation actually takes place. Also running context building and knowledge sharing workshops where the learning happens in the other direction, and we would be able to learn to better understand the political and social context, the current institutional makeup and workings of the city, who are the key local stakeholders involved, how do things currently work, what are the pain points, what's not working, why is this hard, why did you want to do this, all of those kind of things. Once that kind of mutual knowledge sharing has taken place, we'd coordinate an assembly design workshop together with stakeholders and local actors to make sure that whatever is designed is actually co-designed with people on the ground. We are not a practitioner organization, and part of our wider mission is actually being able to empower more people to have the skills and the knowledge to be able to be implementing assemblies themselves. So part of this work would be either training and capacity building a local organization to be able to deliver the assembly, or partnering and working with a local organization that's maybe already doing this. And on our end, we would be providing ongoing advice and guidance throughout the implementation process. Because we will be working with numerous cities around the world, we'll also coordinate knowledge sharing and learning between the cities in the cohort and conduct research and evaluation to make sure that we learn from whatever happens in each of these places. And of course, promoting and disseminating the activities and learnings from all of this. Who can apply? This is open to municipal governments, civil society organizations, and also to developers. And just to flag the key dates, which are also in the full application document, there's about a month now to kind of be able to read through the full paper, to consider the ideas, to have different conversations with people in your cities, and to submit an expression of interest. So it's a fairly short set of questions initially, and we will be having interviews and conversations with this initial group to get a better sense of the motivations and the interest in doing this work. And then we will invite shortlisted cities to make a full application, which is a fair bit longer, a bit more detailed. And those questions really relate to the different things that from our experience over the many years doing this work now have led us to think are some of the conditions needed for success. So trying to preempt that and set things up properly as much as possible. And after another round of conversations, we will choose 3 cities by the end of May to be able to kick off this work properly in June. So we really encourage kind of a wide amount of interest in applications at the outset. If you're not entirely sure, we're also holding some information sessions next week about this as well. So thank you very much for your interest and your attention during this presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and reflections and questions afterwards. But first, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague James, who's going to introduce our 2 speakers today. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, we're very lucky to have two of our task force members agree to speak today. So first up, we have Trivik Verma, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management at TU Delft in the Netherlands. He co-leads the Center for Urban Science and Policy in the Department of Multi-Actor Systems. His research focuses on tackling challenges of urbanization in an equitable and just manner. Trivik uses methods in spatial data science, complex network analysis, and participatory mapping to develop computational and mixed methods for advancing the theories and practices of urban science. He is also the director of the Faculty AI Lab, where he developed a community of scholars around critical AI research and education. He founded the Citizens Collective, which is a platform for science, art, policy, and journalism, showcasing rigor, authenticity, and progressive values for city making. I'll pass it over to Trivik.
Hi, James. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible for everyone. Yeah, that's great. So, hi, everyone. My name is Trivik Verma. I was a member of the task force originally established for building this model. I've been reading all the messages in the chat. It's wonderful to see everyone from around the world doing some very interesting things related to cities. My own work is in a university. I'm an associate professor of geospatial planning, and my focus is on justice in cities. How can we incorporate the value of justice in planning and decision making? And in my experience, I've learned that politicians have a very narrow scope and focus for incentives. So they're running careers on short-termism, and that's very difficult to align with these kinds of values and building infrastructure or social infrastructure for good for people. So I was wondering, I was at a crossroads for some time thinking in my career, what am I writing for? Am I writing towards politicians or policymakers who might not have the right incentives? Or am I really hoping that one day people will come along, politicians and policymakers, of course, will come along and pick up the things that we are doing in terms of city planning and development and somehow be able to use it. So that was the moment when this task force invitation came along, which was very helpful for me, also just to break out of that kind of frustrated area to learn more about how citizen assemblies function, how there's an alternative way of thinking and involving citizens in policy making, and that it actually works, right? So I'm very new to the field, but just from an example in my own work, I was working on a solar transition project in the Netherlands where I'm based, and I realized that although municipalities here have very progressive mindset of providing subsidies and social infrastructure for people to transition to solar energy, the project has pretty much failed in most municipalities because a lot of the barriers that people face were never taken into account in the way that subsidies were allocated for or provided for people, right? So we learned that very quickly that there was no citizen involvement, there was no understanding of the barriers that citizens actually face. And you see that pretty much in this transition, the representation is that rich households that own their own roofs, have transitioned successfully, whereas others haven't. So that was the time when I was also thinking, what next in the way that I work on cities. I use data and I work with policymakers who are very progressive in the Netherlands. But I've realized that they're also bound by their mandates from up, and it's very hard for them to steer their organization's goals from within in a direction that probably has a very positive impact for most people, right? So the task force sort of came at that time when I was pretty lost in the kind of work that I was doing, and I realized and when you reached out with the discussion how to empower citizens, Jane, that was really wonderful for me because suddenly something clicked in my own work and I saw the new road that I could maybe go on. That is maybe helpful for long-term decision-making and goals by involving citizens and supporting them. And I think that was it. I didn't even think twice about it because I wanted to learn about this world much more broadly. So my experience with the task force has been brilliant. In short, I've learned so much from everyone in the team, from all of you, but also from the task force members. You've given me a lot of food for thought, especially in how I would shape my scholarship going forward in the direction of supporting citizen assemblies for planning and policy making. And I've been talking to the policymakers that I know in the Netherlands, just trying to understand where they come from, what is the scope and space for building these kinds of initiatives in cities in the Netherlands where I live. And there is some hope here, so I'm positive, right? And the process has also been truly wonderful. I mean, all of you have been so incredible in organizing and running the task force. After a long time, I thought I was learning something new. Again, instead of becoming a teacher, I was a student. And the idea that a bunch of strangers could come together in a room, find common ground, and start to see each other's point of view, well, I guess that's what citizen assemblies are all about, right? So kudos to all of you for establishing that so well. And I think the task force were organized in a very inclusive and supportive manner as well. I found it to be very welcoming and warm, and space for my ideas, but also space for constructive learning and finding consensus and common ground with the other task force members. And the really amazing thing that I found here was that these assemblies are not top down, right? The work that you've achieved so far, it's a model that is developed in a way with people from around the world who have some knowledge about various different aspects of city planning. And it also creates space for people from all over the world to come in and find their own vision in the model. Like you were just explaining in the presentation, that you can come in anywhere that you like and start to build from there instead of having to adopt this suddenly from scratch, right? I really enjoyed that there were members from all walks of life, from NGOs, from civil society organizations, policy design, academia, public planning and so on, and really gave me the tools now, I feel like, to comprehend and understand how such a system works, and can work in a policymaking apparatus. So I've now started to change my scholarship in writing for policymakers to writing for citizens and people in general, civil society organizations, because I think the first step in changing the way that I personally work from learning from this process is that there are people, and people need to be involved in these processes. And the first step is that we need to divide the scholarship and to disentangle the scholarship for them to be able to understand what it does. So that's me. Thank you so much for giving me the space to talk about my experience here.
Great, thank you so much, Trivik. Really great to hear your reflections, actually, especially on the process and how you felt about the actual convening as well. It's really nice to hear that from you. So our second speaker is Diego Luna Quintanilla, who is a senior project manager at Boer in Belgium. He is an architect, urban designer, and strategic planner interested in inclusive urban projects, and has worked on projects in Belgium, Spain, Tunisia, Pakistan, and Lithuania, and on urban research projects in the Netherlands, Italy, China, Russia, and Ecuador. So Diego joined Boer, part of SWECO, in 2011, and since 2020, he has been coordinating Boer's transition program called Inclusive Neighborhoods. In 2023, Diego was appointed group expert leader to co-develop the Resilient Societies theme for Urban Insight, which is SWECO Group's international knowledge sharing platform. Pass over to Diego.
Yes, hello everybody. Very nice to see you all. James, Claudia, Eva, Ansel, I think Gustav is also in the room, Lucy probably as well, and Trivik, of course. It's very nice. It's been a while, but it's been a very interesting process since we first met each other. Well, maybe about myself, James already said a lot, so maybe I won't spend time on that. Maybe something that to complement what James was saying is that I'm also a co-founder of a small non-profit association, which is a cultural association called CACRI. And the aim of this association is to valorize the street as a cultural space through placemaking and bottom-up cultural projects. So that brings me to the interest I had when I first had the contact with James about the task force, which is actually something that I encounter in my daily practice for a long time already, which is the kind of gap that there is between the planning part and the implementation part. So I work mostly on top-down projects. So there are projects that are supported, or my clients are the municipal or regional authorities or developers. So pretty much from the top-down part of the spectrum. But I realized that there is a lot of difficulties to make these plans and these projects to land in the implementation part, to make them concrete. And on the other hand, I have been also involved in bottom-up or even self-initiated projects, more from the grassroots context. And I also realized that the bottom-up projects, they don't have kind of the means and the capacities and the resources to scale up and to be able to promote this systemic changing that Claudia was talking about. So from one hand, the planning tools, they are quite rigid in a way. They are often contained within very complex bureaucratic systems that are mixed with political tensions and also with some strict legislative framework, which makes that these planning tools, they become very rigid. They are not really able or agile enough to respond to urban urgencies, to catch up with technological innovation, or to deal with the overall changing social behavior. And so that means that these planning tools, sometimes they are not able to go beyond policymaking, which is still a bit far detached from implementation. And then implementation relies mostly on the capacity of other people to operate under the regulations being drafted on the plan. And that's where actually this gap starts to appear, that there's not a connection between the plan and the implementation. And there is this kind of void or own known territory in which the whole continuity and coherence of a planning project, it breaks. There is where a lot of challenges happened, but there's also the space is kind of in between the space. It is a space for innovation. And innovation means, in many senses, is innovation in professional approach, in how spatial planners, architects, urban designers, they deal with the challenges and the questions of society. How can we be able to prepare our urban tissue and our cities to deal with the transitions that we are now facing? Though there is innovation on that side, but there's also a lot of innovation needed in governance. And that's where we need to find ways in which the many stakeholders are part of this collective making of cities. They can find common ground, that they can find ways to organize themselves, that they can provide actually alternatives for the traditional planning. That, as I said before, sometimes it's not enough to be able to realize projects. And that's where actually the innovation in decision-making processes in democratic governance, like citizens' assemblies, are not only needed, but they also play a crucial role in providing this coherence of the urban development, but also in helping citizens, cities, actors, professionals, academy, and all the different people which are involved in city planning in really deal with this transition that we're facing. So, and that was something that for me was interesting to look that this kind of alternative governance is possible. Before being involved with Democracy Next, for me was more about innovative ways of participation with people through projects, but pretty much relying on the specificity of a specific project, on the goodwill of a specific municipality, or on the kind of project definition that was drafted in the tender, for instance, of a project. But now I believe more and more that this kind of more structural approach to decision making can be also institutionalized. So that's something that should not be only popping up from good projects and from good governance, traditional governments, but also can become a structural way to bridge these two spectrums, let's say. And that's something that was kind of confirmed as well through the task force, because as Trivik was saying, it was indeed an incredible experience with the people with a lot of expertise from different contexts on different issues and different challenges. But they were also, through their experience and through the learning, showing examples of concrete success stories that made me think and realize that this kind of innovation is possible. It was an interesting process also because, as also Trivik was saying, we had to go through very complex conversations. But nevertheless, we always arrived to a kind of a red line that was guiding the whole process. And that was something that I believe it was pretty much well taken and translated into the document that is being presented today. So it's a good synthesis actually of this complexity. And I'm very excited to see what's next. I'm really looking forward to the whole process for the call for the cities to participate and to also follow up what's happening there. I think it would be of great value to just dive into the topic and really try to apply it. I repeat, I think we need innovation, and for that we need experimentation. We need to dare, we need to try, we need to really get out of comfort zones and try out things. That's the only way forward. And I'm very grateful for the organization, for the whole project, Democracy Next. I think you're doing a great job, but also of all the people who are around being motivated and involved. I'm learning a lot from that. And I hope to keep on being involved in the long term, because this is really something important, I think. So thanks again. I hope I didn't take too long with my explanation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Diego. No, you didn't go over time. We're running right on time, I think, here. So thank you to the both of you. I'll hand it over now to Claudia to moderate our discussion.
Yeah, thanks, James. And thank you, Trivik and Diego, for sharing also your reflections and experiences, because both of you have, quite a different lens to this. Like, we're coming in as democracy innovation experts, and you've worked in many different countries and working kind of on the ground in planning projects in academia, actually, working together with the architects and municipalities on an ongoing basis. So having your perspectives on what are the problems that get faced on the ground was very useful. And I think one of the threads that I picked up from both of you and what you were emphasizing is that the kind of propositions that we'd collectively come up with are ambitious in some ways, because they're focused on the structural systemic changes, not just one-off initiatives, but they're also possible and inspired by a lot of examples of things that have shown us what can be done. So just to emphasize that. So I want to open it up now, though, to more of a conversation and discussion and questions. We have lots of people here with us today. Because it's quite a big group, I'm suggesting that maybe if people can use the little like virtual hand raising option, and I will call on people. But also feel free if you prefer to add any questions into the chat. We'll also pick up on those and weave them in between some of the conversations or questions that may come up with anyone. And while we're waiting maybe for someone to maybe put their hand up or wanting to chime in, I'll pick up on the first question that I've seen in the chat here that came in from Susanna Pressel, who's a councillor in Oxford. And so there's a few questions actually in here. So she's saying that the City Council ran a successful Citizens Assembly in 2019 on the climate crisis, but two problems that they found were that other citizens didn't believe them when they said that the participants were a random sample, and secondly, that citizens' assemblies are expensive to run. And actually there's a third question in here around asking developers to run them, but assuming most would say no. So I mean, I'm kind of happy to pick up maybe on answering some of those initial questions, which I think are targeted a little bit more at some of the experience with assemblies. So I mean, on the first instance, I don't know enough about like the specific context of how things were done and run in this Oxford Assembly. So I'm speaking kind of from that perspective of not being super familiar with things. I mean, I think sometimes part of the issue with the one-off assemblies that happen, and with a lot of these ideas with random selection, sortition, the lottery process being a new element of things, some people are not familiar with that in the wider population. In the projects that we've always been involved in at Democracy Next, and other projects I've also done beforehand, also with my colleague Yeva and others in the team, one of the things we've always really done is kind of in the lead up to an assembly, there's a lot of time and work spent with doing a lot of awareness raising, and also speaking with wider groups of stakeholders, local groups, for them to understand what is the Citizens Assembly, the fact that this is going to happen, how is this different, how does the random selection process work. I also don't know about how the lottery process took place, but there's also a spectrum of methodologies around this as well. And part of the motivation for the work that we had done at the OECD previously to Democracy Next on establishing good practice principles for citizens' assemblies was also about trying to get around some of the potential issues that may arise. And one of the good practice principles has a big emphasis on how the sortition process takes place, with a huge amount of transparency and really done in a way to fulfill the principle that everybody living in a place technically had an equal chance of being selected to be part of it, and that there's a way to be able to show that to people. I think there'll always be a tiny minority of skeptics and people, for whatever reason, who will not want to believe things, but on the whole haven't really encountered this this kind of issue before with citizens being skeptical about the random selection process. So I don't know if you wanted to intervene, would also welcome you to explain a little bit the context around that. On the expense of it, And actually, I'll share a few things, but I would love to hear Trivik and Diego, who have experience with other types of engagement and how much those cost, and also issues of other things that arise from it. But in some ways, yes, citizens' assemblies can be seen as expensive. In other ways, they're really not, compared to how much we invest in all the infrastructure that surrounds our electoral system to ensure that this is like a fair and legitimate process. We're actually spending a lot less on the citizens' assemblies at the moment, and there's just a certain amount that needs to go into ensuring that this is a genuinely democratic exercise and not just technocratic in nature. So things like paying people, ensuring that there's childcare, the fact that this process needs more time, are all the things that end up it costing a bit more. But I think there's also a reflection to bring in around the kind of costs that get saved by being enabled to actually take a decision on something. So from a lot of the conversations that we've had with different people in places that have run assemblies, often they've occurred around an issue that has been an issue for a very long time and either has faced protests or inaction, and there's been lots of costs involved with a failed policy not taking place. And so having a citizens' assembly that enables a city government to be able to take a decision, have the legitimacy to do that and garner wider support for it, is actually something that over the long run ends up costing a lot less than having a failed process in place. So maybe on that front, I'll pause there. And I don't know if Trivik or Diego, one of you would also like to come in and share some experiences, like, from working with other kinds of participation processes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claudia. I think I can maybe just briefly say that in my experience as an academic, it sometimes helps to couple these projects with the academy. There's institutional public funding already going to researchers, and if they're interested in working alongside with city planners and urban planners, councillors, then often what happens in the Netherlands is projects are tied together with working with the municipality and a diverse array of stakeholders, and then some of the costs can be absorbed if we tie this together, that it's helpful for the research, but also helpful for the city to actually at least show an example that this works. And then maybe use that and use the positives from the project as the next step to apply for maybe more funding to the national governments. And just my view on this is in terms of allocating budgets, national governments often think that they don't produce money, but they're the only people in the world who do produce money out of nothing. So I think they can eventually allocate money to cities in ways that it's useful for citizen assemblies to pop up all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying, Claudia, and also Trivik. And I've seen it already happening in many projects, that a long planning process that was not properly structured around good participation, consultation, or involvement of communities, they have at the end ultimately failed completely. So efforts of years of work in which I've been working have been just left aside because at the end it didn't land anywhere, just because the process was not designed like that. So there's a lot of resources that are wasted if we don't invest it in the right time. And this is indeed something that is lacking. We need, in public projects, we need more resources for the democratic consultation, participation, or decision-making parts. Otherwise, the risks are higher. Actually, it's about minimizing risks in projects. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you both. And I see Ian has his hand up. I also just wanted to turn to the question that was raised about the developers wanting to run them, and assuming most would say no as well, so we don't lose track of that. So unfortunately, one of our task force members, Jesse Shapins, couldn't join us for one of these meetings, but we did actually have a developer and an investor involved in the task force as well to be able to get some of that perspective, and we also consulted a bit more widely with some others too. And the sense was that, for them, they're often required to do some form of consultation, and actually often those requirements are a bit constraining for them as well, and it's not ideal or helpful for the projects. Often they only have to take place kind of quite late after a lot of decisions have been taken, but for developers there's a lot of risk involved if they've invested a lot in trying to get a project off the ground, and then there's protests or other reasons that end up blocking or really delaying a project from taking place. So from the conversations we were having, there was an interest in actually exploring other more constructive kinds of forms of engaging people that would enable them to be able to reduce the risk of their projects and end up with better designs for what they're developing. And that, I think, like with many others in the field, it's not that they just have not ever wanted to do a citizens' assembly. It's also often not the sort of thing they've ever thought about doing or being possible. So part of our aim is also to put the ideas out there and say, you know, this could be an alternative to the kind of town hall meetings you're usually holding, because that's what's typical in the field around different proposals quite late in the game, and to sort of shift the timing and the approach and the process in a way that would be helpful and beneficial to them as well. So I will.
Just come in as well. I just want to give two brief examples that I know about in the UK as well, where developers have actually used a citizens' assembly process. I'm not super knowledgeable about both processes, but I know that they use sortition and the citizens' assembly model to help kind of guide some of the main elements of developments that have happened. One of which was in Cambridge, and another which was in Brixton in the south of London as well. So I know that there are developers out there who are actually using these tools and experimenting and seeing what comes out of it. So just to add that in as well.
Perfect. Thanks, James. I'll turn to Ian first, and then I see we have a couple more questions in the chat that we can pick up on after that. So, Ian.
Sure. I have a mercifully short question. There's one problem that faces every minister here. How does Sydney add 400,000 houses in 20 years? I noticed you didn't include an example around kind of a blunt force question like that. Why?
Sorry, Ian, what do you mean about why?
For me, that's the hardest problem facing politicians. And I got some sense that you're coming from, you know, we kind of start from a politician point first rather than a community point first. But for me, that's the big elephant out there that every politician is sweating on, probably in multiple countries. Why is housing getting expensive? Because it's impossible to get anything approved. Everyone objects to anything. I'm just curious if you wrestled with that and discarded it, and if so, what was the reasoning?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think maybe that's a fair somewhat criticism of things. I mean, it's not that we discarded that. Like, we do hope that actually the response to that question comes through in the proposals that we have put forth. I suppose this is maybe where the challenge of working with general proposals that can be relevant in some way for different contexts, because I hear you that that's the big framing of the problem in Sydney, but that's not necessarily the same exact framing of the problem everywhere else either. And so having a mix of tools and options on the table from a mix of either an ad hoc assembly that deals with that particular issue, or that's the sort of thing that I would imagine would actually be for a more ongoing assembly that's actually connected into a city council project to be able to tackle and take on a bit more head on. So it's maybe not as like direct and explicit in that specific question, but we do hope that the proposals actually address that. So thanks for your question, Ian. All right, I'm going to turn now to a couple of the questions in the chat. So first from Ed Carroll, and also if you did want to like come in and share any additional context or anything to your question, feel free to add a hand up, but there's absolutely no obligation and pressure to do that either. So I'll read them out otherwise. So is it expecting too much of a citizens' assembly alone to fill the void between local people and territorial visioning and planning? I'm not sure if Trivik or Diego, one of you would like to take this on. Otherwise, also happy to jump in. But yeah.
I don't believe indeed that it has to be alone. I think it's part of an ecosystem of many things happening, but it kind of play a role on bridging things. I think that's the main strategic purpose of a citizen assembly, is to really bridge, on one hand, networks of actors, initiatives, individual will, and individual the individual motivation to be part of a decision making with the institutional part. But the institution is also a complex network of different organisms. So for me, it's more is a system that helps to create balance, continuity, and coherence. But it's not the only responsible of things, for sure.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that I think the institution currently does not face accountability in many parts of the world, and having a continuity but an ongoing assembly makes sure that the system is going to be accountable for the decisions it makes for the long-term thinking.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And I think maybe the only other thing I would kind of add in emphasis to that question is that I think that the Citizens Assembly, particularly kind of with the use of sortition and random selection, and the fact that we're suggesting this should not just be a one-off initiative, gets around the issue that, you know, we're not expecting people to have to be involved in every single decision all the time either, because that's also not possible or really feasible, and I would say probably not even desirable. And so how do we have mechanisms that really do give people a really deep and meaningful way of being involved, but that it's not also an ask that everyone is involved in that way every time for every kind of decision. So there's that kind of balance between how do we get that citizen input and have it meaningful, but also, you know, have a bridge. I think Diego's kind of word and metaphor was a nice way of framing that and connecting it. Okay, I will maybe turn to Robbie next, who has his hand up, and then I'll go back to the next question in the chat after.
This is a question for Trivik and Diego, but maybe James, you might have something, and Yevi, you might have something as well around the task force experience. Given that it was sort of set up to be very multidisciplinary, it wasn't. I think Claudia had been very thoughtful about not convening a group of people who are sort of already deeply immersed in the space. Were there any key sort of aha connection moments that sort of you made during that process of having that multidisciplinary people from different kinds of backgrounds? Were there sort of key things which you came into it not expecting to think about or find in those discussions?
Very fascinating question, Robbie. Thank you for that. It's also difficult to answer. But I think that there was one thing that really struck with me, which was the informality of certain processes. Often we think about institutionalizing everything. And I thought that I learned quite a bit from a couple of task force members, how informal processes also led to a lot of development and positive progress in certain decision-making avenues. And I think retaining that informality is often also key if you want to include local people in decision making. As soon as you institutionalize things, sometimes I feel like there's a lot of burden, and then a lot of people who are not part of that institution might feel like they're left behind, that they cannot participate in policymaking and political processes. So there has to be certain level of informality that goes hand in hand, in my experience, to have people collaborate and contribute to progress.
We actually had in the workshop an aha moment discussion, and it was very, very interesting. And I found it in my notes. So one of the points that I remember that was quite revealing was one case that was presented. It was in the context of Africa, of an informal settlement, and it was how the organic way in which the informal settlement was organized spatially, so how the houses were organized within compounds, and all that actually lay out the framework for a governance model that helped very much to make decisions. So the link actually between governance and urban form was very explicit and very, very easy to to make the connection between decision making and space. So that was quite revealing that this kind of constructions, both political or governance and spatial, they are part of one thing.
Yeah, I want to add to that as well that, yeah, I think that was actually one of the examples I was going to bring up too, but from the perspective of scale, also the example from Gabriela Gomez-Mont, who discussed the crowdsourcing a constitution, which involved tens or hundreds of thousands of people participating in forming Mexico City's new constitution in 2016, I believe it was. Just understanding just in pure forms the scale of a participation and the impact that it can possibly have as well, because we think of citizens' assembly as quite a small microcosm of society, but these wider participation strategies, which we say in the paper, really plug into the assemblies, how they can have such an impact and how wide and kind of far-reaching they can be as well. So that was kind of an aha moment for me as well, or a very interesting moment during the task force convening.
You.
Very good question, Robbie. Thanks for asking that. I think it revealed and brought out a few of the other examples from the voices that we don't have with us today as well. I see that there was one other question in the chat that was from much earlier on, so I don't want to ignore that before going to Ollie. So it's from Joe, who is saying that you know, a complex issue on public administration is the lobby of construction companies and other private groups to develop the town in a certain direction. So a citizens' assembly may face limits on how its recommendations can really be implemented. Any thoughts on this particular issue? So I don't know if one of you would like to jump in on this in particular. Maybe James, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tough one because it is inextricably linked with development and with the design work that comes out of architecture offices or urban planning firms. It is very much part and a very strong part of the ecosystem of actors who build cities. For me, I think it comes down to kind of a question of legitimacy and accountability for the citizens' assembly itself, and how you, I don't know, try and build up that public awareness, which also then hopefully creates a public support for such an assembly as well, which also can then have an impact on those private groups and what they take seriously and what they don't take seriously. It's much easier to ignore recommendations that come out of a citizens' assembly nobody's heard about than to actually ignore them when they're being presented publicly, when they're being presented as part of a conversation of a community itself in supporting or creating recommendations for a particular project. So, I mean, this happens much more likely or much more often on a national scale when you have citizens' assemblies in Ireland or in France dealing with much larger sort of constitutional issues. It becomes somewhat of a national conversation, but I think those kinds of conversations can still happen at a local level as well, surrounding a certain project, and having people kind of aware. And part of that as well can also possibly create a pressure on that lobby to change its ways. But I mean, of course, it's kind of an indirect way. I'm not sure if others have other thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think anyways, within the institutionalization of a citizen assembly, you also need the support of the legal framework to enforce actually certain things. So even though the recommendations are recommendations, they're also recommendations for the authority delivering permits to judge a project. Maybe not in all of them, but it has to have this kind of influence and this kind of support. So again, it is part of a wider ecosystem of decision-making and governance. But these recommendations, they need the support of the people who are actually able to have really strong decisions, legally binding decisions around projects. So it's actually on the benefit of the private developer to follow recommendations, because they will guarantee that permits can be delivered, because they are actually filling all the ticks on the box.
Can I just add something as well? I think actually back to Ian's point about like, how do we just get housing built, and how can we argue that kind of assemblies won't slow down that process any more than it's already experiencing. I think it really depends on where you put that assembly in the process of making these decisions as well. If you put an assembly at the very front end of a housing policy that is actually meant to speed up the development or delivery of housing, rather than for every individual project, there's also an opportunity there to make things go faster than they currently are. So just a thought that came in while we were discussing this.
Yeah, and if I can just add something, I'm sorry, Ollie, you've been waiting for a bit. Just to wrap it up, I think in the Netherlands, at least, the national governments do subsidize a lot of the development efforts and provide loans and institutional support to these organizations. So I think if people want something and through a legitimate process of citizen assemblies, they're able to articulate what they want, it's possible for governments to steer towards that process. Right. And it's possible for them to change the way that lobbies or development efforts are going to shape up in a city. And yeah.
Great, thanks to the three of you. All right, I'll turn over to Ollie now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a connected question, I think, in terms of the recommendations piece, but I was just wondering in your work whether you've looked into how the actual deliberation part of the assembly between citizens changes for urban planning problems versus more policy issues. I'm thinking particularly around like the physicality. I know there's a lot of assemblies that happen on the vision setting for planning and city planning, but I'm thinking really what are the kind of physical implications of that in space, public space, and even housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like probably I can try and answer this one from some of the experience of looking at this over time. I mean, bit of a shame because yesterday we had Daniel Fuska, who's like one of the managers in the city of Toronto, who I think would probably be able to tell you from more direct experience on how it's different as well. But from having spoken with him and also others in the field around this, I think part of the deliberation in a place and in a city and around stuff that is physical also involves like walking around the city and going to different places. And like I know even for example like in Paris around homelessness, the assembly members have actually been going out into the streets and they're not just sitting in the town hall deliberating amongst themselves. So I think that's definitely one of the things that when it's not just maybe something that's like a maybe more intangible policy issue ends up taking place. And it's a really good point to kind of like bring that out. And yeah, I don't know if there was like a more specific aspect to it that you wanted to comment on, but that's kind of the thing that comes to my mind about what's maybe different in the city and urban planning kind of context. So yeah.
I can just add a quick example to that too, also from the city of Toronto that Daniel has told me about, where they're using civic lotteries or sortition on a more localized level for very specific projects. So they're working on a new recreation center for a particular part of the city right now, and they've done a selection process for people who live within the catchment area of that recreation center. And there's an existing recreation center that will be kind of renovated or partly demolished for the new one. And they're kind of visiting the site, being part of the design workshops, also talking with civil society organizations who are active in that area to really design kind of the main elements of the new proposal, or at least the key objectives or key goals of the design. And they're really physically there as well, because it's going to be a physical development in their actual communities. So there are examples of that as well.
Yeah, it's a good point, James.
Maybe a quick reaction on that as well. It's that we're actually facing a lot of challenges, and we are in this transition path. But we actually, to be able to accomplish this, we need to also change our behavior. And actually, social behavior happens on the neighborhood scale, on the places for the daily life. And this is where the whole experience, knowledge on the daily life of people in the daily spaces are crucial actually to be able to deal with this transition. Otherwise, we stay pretty far detached from implementation, as I was saying. So the experience of a neighborhood scale and the daily life of people, it is crucial for us to be able to really deal with these challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point as well, Diego. Thank you. I think we'll take one last question from Nadine, who has her hand up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I'm looking especially at smaller communities, like more towns and cities, and or maybe larger villages in Germany. And this is why I also posted the German guided line or handbook, why I know about it. So what I heard often is so it's something that is so citizen assemblies are executed more and more. So that's great and becoming more popular. But what I also heard is like the problem is often that we have been done, there are great results, but then the results are not executed because they may be too strategic, not concrete actions, or the politician changed in between because we had new selection and then others are in charge, or the responsibilities in total were not really clear, like who's taking it over, and then it's not really carried out. So, and do you have like any recommendations, maybe like right from the start in the design of the whole process to consider that so that you don't run into that problem afterwards? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very excellent question about how to actually ensure follow-up and accountability, and that something happens after these assemblies. So yeah, I don't know if one of you wants to come in, or James, if you want to talk about any of the examples of the follow-up committees that exist in the permanent assemblies.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I was responding to a question in the chat there, so
Okay, that's okay.
the first part of the question.
I
My
could also,
apologies,
yeah.
Nadine.
So it's about how to make sure that the results that are being created in the citizen assemblies are really getting executed, so really carried out, because often you have like a change in the politicians because of new elections that took place, or it's not clear who has the responsibility, and it's put into a forum and nobody has clearly a responsibility, so nothing is happening, or it's maybe too strategic, the actions are not clear. And I'm wondering if you can consider that like right from the start of the design of the whole process, so it's not like coming up as a problem at the end, but you already try to tackle that. Because I mean, I've been involved in so many strategic workshops, and the execution is mainly the thing or the problem, I have the feeling, like in so many areas. Yeah,
it's an important point. I mean, it's something that we include in the proposals that we put in the paper. This idea of an engagement committee, which acts as that kind of liaison and sort of follows and tracks and makes sure that those recommendations are being acted upon or being at least considered or responded to. There are examples of that from different assemblies around the world. I know in Scotland, for example, they did a large national climate assembly, and they had a secretariat from the very beginning that was constantly communicating what was being developed within the assembly process to the appropriate relevant departments within the government itself, to make sure that they were kind of up to date about what was being developed, what could actually become a recommendation in the end, and what they would maybe then have to act upon in the end as well. I believe also, correct me if I'm wrong, Claudia, within the Brussels Climate Assembly, there's also this kind of body that is composed of randomly selected, like another group of randomly selected citizens from the initial group that then go have this role of this liaison kind of role and follow-up role with the government too. So it's about designing those mechanisms from the very, very beginning, rather than having run the whole process, get to the end and say, okay, now what do we do? And it landing on a desk of a civil servant or somebody in decision-making power. Maybe they haven't heard of the assembly, or they haven't followed the process. So it's really about front-ending those kind of design mechanisms at the very, very beginning.
Yeah, and is there maybe a software? So I also heard about this citizen budget. Do you know that citizen can design about let's say 1 million, and what should we do with it? Should we put benches or playing ground or whatever, right? And I mean, and with these tools, you can also follow up like what is happening with the proposals. I was thinking, is there maybe some kind of follow-up software which makes it really transparent what is putting out there and what's happening with the ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's definitely, especially for transparency's sake, for the wider public as well. I think that would be a kind of an excellent mechanism. I don't know, do we have examples of that, Claudia, from previous assemblies, or is there something related to that at all that you know of?
In terms of there being like a live following about what's happening to the recommendation?
Yeah.
Not that I know of. I mean, the only one that I can think of actually is related to the French Citizens Assembly on Climate, where the ministry actually published something, but then there were controversies around like how they were interpreting like to what extent they were actually following up on that or not and otherwise. But I think it's been one of the things that's been, I think, hardest in the field. Like when Yeva and I were doing the research, like we were both at the OECD and led the big deliberative wave study, and as part of that we were trying to look into the impact and the implementation of different recommendations, and just even finding the information of what's happened after the assemblies was really, really hard. So we did our best, and we found, I think, something like around almost 100 examples where there was a clear sense of what happened. You know, there were reports or there were websites that existed, but that means in the majority of the cases, you know, that's not happening, and that's something that we've definitely advocated for being a key thing that needs to happen, needs to change as well. And I think it's something that's just a bit complex and complicated, because often, I think, as you probably know, and people who are working in this field, the change doesn't happen overnight. So even if a decision is taken one day, it might be implemented 6 months later. So kind of taking into account those kind of timelines and timeframes is something that I think is part of the challenge, but that shouldn't stop there being more transparency and communication on that as well.
Yeah, this is interesting because yesterday I was talking to a software developer in that kind of participation software field, and he said that this is something. From him, I got the information. So I was thinking if it's a software solution could really help here, because staying on track with these different topics, especially over time, and you don't have to build it every time yourself, right? Because it's it's not necessary. I would say it's kind of same structure every time. So if you have I don't know. I'm just thinking now loudly if there's maybe some idea to collaborate with him, because he has something at hand already, and create something that could be used for these kind of processes, because I think that's really crucial. So it's not going into the wrong direction, like, and disappoint people even more, right, afterwards.
No, indeed. Well, thank you very much, Nadine. If you want to follow up with us, we'd be happy to do a follow-up on that with you. So thanks very much. Diego, I felt like you had wanted to come in on this, but I'm also conscious on time. So maybe, because I wanted to ask both you and Trivik to share any kind of like last thoughts or reflections that you had, also maybe things that came up through this conversation. So if you wanted to also add whatever you wanted to say, but also weave in other kind of remarks for a kind of closing before we wrap up, because I'm kind of mindful. I want to try and finish on time to respect people's time. So please, maybe Diego first this time.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe it's linked with the previous question, but it's also something interesting to reflect on. Is that you pointed very clearly on the report, on the paper, the idea of having different types of citizen assembly, and that's very important, because each type of citizen assembly, they will tie or be also subscribe within a different level of governance. And also that's very important, because when you're talking about citywide assemblies, you know that the kind of decisions that are made citywide are more on the order of agenda setting, principles, policy making, which is the direction we're taking. So it's not so concrete as when you actually look for an ad hoc citizens assembly on a specific particular project, where you can actually narrow down the scope of the question into a concrete example, and therefore it's easier to monitor as well, because you probably within the design of the assembly, you will need to also think about short-term actions and how to evaluate and monitor them. So it's interesting to look at how the assembly support a governance structure to make this bridge that we were talking about, but it's not a replacement of a kind of a logic of governance. And this multi-scalar approach is very important to acknowledge it, actually.
Thank you, Diego. And Trivik?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo the same thing Diego said, but maybe in a different way. That I think the model that the team has developed, it's really fluid and dynamic, and people can find entry points anywhere they like. It feels like transforming an entire city might be too much without the support of multiple stakeholders, but I feel like there's important ways of easy ways of getting into it from ground up, from building communities in your neighborhood or building communities for a particular project. As like an academic, I found that it was very relevant to start thinking about projects in a very different way. And With other colleagues, we've been thinking about how our projects can involve citizen assemblies, citizen groups in developing the ideas and the processes that we envision our city to be. And that has so far worked really well, I think, in a couple of grants that we've applied for and worked in. And I feel like that's the way to go. It's to really go bottom up and start building things in your neighborhoods and your communities.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think that is one of the messages that we wanted to get across, that, you know, there are opportunities for action for different actors in this ecosystem, because there's many different ones involved. It's a relationship, and, you know, there's different entry points for making change happen, and there's a holistic vision of how they can all come together, but there's also different starting points that might feel more or less feasible in different places. So we hope people come away with a sense of feeling like, you know, this is possible to get going on this. So really wanted to thank all of you for joining us for the launch event of our report on 6 ways to democratize city planning. This was a really rich conversation. Thank you for the excellent questions that we asked as well. And I really want to also thank the whole DemocracyNext team for all their really hard work on this to bring this together, as well as both of you and the wider international task force and the stakeholder group that we worked with to develop this feedback.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really great to see both you, Trivik and Diego, again today, and great to see so many people join as well. I also see we have May as well from Peze Studio and a few others too. So thank you for joining us. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, a good afternoon, and also keep an eye out too. Yeah, I want to add that's right about the open application for cities. We have this on our website at the moment. I think it's shared in the chat here as well. But if you are working in a city, or you're a developer, or you're a civil society organization and you're interested in partnering with us, you can find all that information on our website and the application form as well. So we'd love to hear from you.
Indeed, we encourage you to apply. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks
Thank you.
for joining us. Thank you. Thanks, Trivik and Diego.